The courtroom was silent, except for the scratch of a pen carving judgment into a boy's life. How absurd that one flick of ink, one line on paper, could decide whether a 17-year-old lived in chains or died in shadows. Yet there he was, Judge William Ashcroft, the proud emblem of white law and order, signing his name with a flourish that looked more like a dagger than justice. No applause followed. No sigh of relief echoed through the heavy air. Only the quiet whimper of a mother in the gallery broke the stillness, her voice cracking like a fragile glass when she whispered her son's name. Elijah. He stood straight, back unbroken, though every eye weighed on him as though he were already guilty, already condemned. His skin, dark as midnight, seemed to scream louder than any evidence presented. He had spoken with trembling honesty, but no one listened. To them, his words were swallowed before they even reached their ears. In their minds, he was not a boy. He was not a student, not a son, not a dreamer. He was a suspect, a shadow, a threat. And William Ashcroft, in his crisp black robe and polished gavel, was the one who held the power to make that shadow permanent. He told himself he was only serving the law, only upholding order. Yet his hand shook as he placed the pen down. He thought no one saw it, but Elijah did. Their eyes met for a fleeting second, the teenager's gaze steady, unwavering, filled with something that burned hotter than fear. William's throat tightened. He looked away, but in that instant, something had cracked. The trial had been a spectacle, a carnival of bias parading as justice. The prosecutor painted Elijah as a predator lurking in alleyways, twisting the story of a fight gone wrong into a tale of deliberate malice. The jury, a sea of pale faces, nodded along as if the script had been written before the curtain rose. Witnesses contradicted each other, evidence blurred under scrutiny, but none of it mattered. The boy was black, the victim white, and the town demanded blood. William told himself he was detached, impartial, a vessel of the law. But every time Elijah spoke, something about the cadence of his words, the quiver of youth in his voice, clawed at William's chest. He wanted to drown it out, to bury it beneath the rules he had lived by his whole career. And so he did what was expected. He signed. But now, as the gavel struck and the guards moved to take Elijah away, the sound did not echo with authority. It echoed like a coffin lid closing. And for the first time in decades, Judge William Ashcroft felt fear. Not of the boy, not of the crowd outside, but of himself. That night, sleep refused him. Every time he shut his eyes, Elijah's face burned into the dark. The look was not hatred. It was not even despair. It was something sharper, something William had spent his entire life avoiding. Truth. A truth he knew but had buried so deep that only now, when confronted with the defiance of a black child, did it claw its way back. For buried in William's past was a story he never told, a secret he swore would rot inside him. The secret that he, too, had once trembled under the weight of injustice, not as a judge, not as a man of law, but as a boy who had watched a life destroyed, who had witnessed a cruelty that defined the path he thought he was escaping. He rose from bed, pacing the dark corridors of his house, his wife asleep in another room, unaware of the storm unraveling inside him. He poured a drink, but it tasted like ash. He stared at his reflection in the window, a man carved from marble, respected, feared, yet hollow. The pen he had signed with lay on his desk. He picked it up, rolling it between his fingers, and for a moment, he imagined it was a weapon aimed at himself. By morning, the town was buzzing. Headlines proclaimed justice served. Crowds roared approval. To them, the verdict was final, sealed. But to William, the ink was still wet, bleeding into his conscience. Elijah sat in a cell, staring at the cracks on the ceiling, tracing patterns that looked like roads leading out. His lawyer had done what he could, but the system was a wall too high to climb. Yet Elijah refused to crumble. He replayed the trial in his mind, the sneers, the smirks, the way the judge's hand trembled when he signed. That tremor was a seed of doubt, and Elijah clung to it. Somewhere inside that man, humanity lived, even if it was buried beneath layers of prejudice and pride. And that humanity was about to surface. William found himself driving through streets he hadn't seen in decades, past neighborhoods he had once avoided, places where his childhood memories festered. He parked outside a crumbling house, its paint peeling, its windows clouded with dust. Memories crashed over him: a boyhood friend, a laugh, a night that ended in fire and blood. He had never told anyone. He had let the story rot, because telling it would mean admitting he had stood by, silent, as injustice crushed someone he loved. And now, years later, he had done the same thing again. His hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He could hear Elijah's voice in his head, pleading, not for mercy, but for recognition, for truth. And William knew that unless he faced what he had buried, the boy's life would end under the same weight that had haunted him for years. The golden morning sun spilled across the street, lighting the cracked pavement. For the first time in years, William felt its warmth not as comfort, but as judgment. The pen was still in his pocket. He had signed a verdict. But perhaps, just perhaps, he could rewrite it. The morning bled into noon, but Judge William Ashcroft remained frozen in his car outside that old house, staring at the rotting wood as if it might open its mouth and swallow him whole. The weight of memory was unbearable, pressing against his ribs until breathing itself felt like a confession. He could see it clearly now. The night flames licked the sky and swallowed the only friend who had ever looked at him without judgment, without the heavy lens of skin and bloodlines. His name had been Marcus. William hadn't spoken that name aloud in over 40 years. Marcus had been black, fearless in the way only young boys could be when they believed the world had space for their laughter. They had played baseball in dusty lots, shared stolen apples, whispered secrets under porch lights. Until one summer night, when the town's hatred boiled over. The mob had been quick, efficient, merciless. They accused Marcus of a crime William knew he hadn't committed, something absurd: stealing from a corner store, fighting back when insulted. But in their eyes, his skin alone was the verdict. William had hidden, paralyzed, as torches lit the dark and fists closed around Marcus. He remembered the sound of his friend's voice, calling his name once, only once, before it was drowned by screams. And William had done nothing. That silence had followed him his entire life, buried beneath layers of ambition, law, and robes of respectability. He had told himself he'd chosen the path of justice to atone, but every verdict he had signed was another brick in the wall of his denial. Until a boy with eyes that burned like Marcus's had looked straight at him in court and shattered the silence. William exhaled, the sound breaking in the empty car. He pressed his forehead against the steering wheel and whispered, "I failed you, Marcus. And I'm failing him too." The next day, whispers of unrest trickled through the town. Elijah's conviction had sparked anger in the black community, protests rising like heat on summer asphalt. Signs filled the streets, voices chanting his name, demanding justice. To the white majority, it was noise and inconvenience. To William, it was an echo of the mob he had seen as a boy, except this time, the torches burned with hope, not hate. He sat in chambers, drowning in paperwork, but the words blurred. Each file felt like a coffin. He glanced at the pen again, the same pen that had condemned Elijah, and it seemed heavier than any gavel. The prosecutor visited him, smug and satisfied, boasting of the message the verdict had sent. William nodded, masking the turmoil inside, but every word tasted like poison. The prosecutor's arrogance was familiar, a mask William himself had worn for years. And in that moment, he realized he could no longer carry it. That evening, William did something reckless. He requested the full trial transcripts, the evidence logs, every scrap of paper tied to Elijah's case. Alone in his study, he spread them across his desk. And as he read, he saw with brutal clarity what he had ignored: contradictions, gaps, witnesses coerced, testimonies twisted. The case was flimsy, built not on fact but on prejudice. He had known it, deep down, even as the gavel struck. But now the truth stared him in the face. And it wasn't just Elijah's life on trial. It was his own soul. William's wife, Margaret, found him there in the dark, papers strewn around him like ashes. She had always known him as stoic, unshakable, a man who lived by rules carved in stone. But tonight he looked small, fragile, a man stripped of armor. "What are you doing?" she asked softly. He looked up, eyes hollow. "I sentenced a boy to rot in prison for something he didn't do. And it's not the first time I've watched innocence be destroyed." Margaret froze, sensing the weight in his voice. She reached for him, but he recoiled, ashamed. He told her everything about Marcus, about his silence, about Elijah's eyes. His words poured out, decades of guilt unchained. And when he finished, silence hung between them, thick and unforgiving. "You can't change the past," she whispered. "I can change this," he said, voice trembling but resolute. "I have to." The next morning, William made a decision that would shatter the town's illusion of justice. He filed an emergency motion to reopen Elijah's case, citing judicial error. His colleagues sneered. The prosecutor raged. The press exploded. A white judge questioning his own verdict for a black teenager? It was unthinkable. But William no longer cared about the walls of tradition. He had lived inside them too long, suffocating in silence. Now he would burn them down if it meant one boy did not suffer Marcus's fate. The courtroom once again filled with bodies, tension thick enough to choke on. Protesters lined the streets outside, chants rattling the windows. Inside, Elijah sat shackled, his eyes flicking to William with cautious disbelief. The judge's face was pale, lips thin, but his hands, those traitorous, trembling hands, were steady now. As the hearing began, William spoke words no one expected to hear. "I made a mistake." Gasps rippled through the room. The prosecutor objected furiously. The jury looked lost. The gallery buzzed like a hive. But William continued, his voice cracking with honesty he had denied himself for decades. He recounted the failures of the trial, the evidence ignored, the prejudice that had poisoned the verdict. He admitted his bias, admitted his fear, admitted the silence that had haunted him since childhood. And then, for the first time in his career, he told the truth about Marcus. The courtroom froze. The image of a young boy lynched by hatred, a boy William had betrayed with his silence, spilled into the air like smoke. He spoke of cowardice, of guilt, of the vow he had made to never let such injustice happen again, a vow he had broken until this very moment. Tears lined the faces of those listening, though others glared with fury, their vision of their white judge crumbling. But William did not falter. He looked at Elijah, and for the first time, he felt Marcus beside him, their eyes merging into one truth. "I cannot erase what has been done," William said, his voice steady. "But I will not allow this court to stand on lies. Elijah Williams deserves freedom, not chains." The decision was not his alone, bound by legal tangles and politics. But his words had set fire to the silence. Appeals surged forward, activists rallied, journalists dug deeper. The town could no longer look away. And through it all, Elijah remained defiant. He spoke at rallies from behind bars, his voice carried through bullhorns, recorded on shaky cell phones, spreading across the country. His story became larger than himself, a symbol of resistance, of hope, of truth clawing its way through the cracks of a broken system. William, once a pillar of that system, now stood on the other side. He faced ridicule, threats, calls for his resignation. Old friends turned their backs, colleagues whispered betrayal. But he accepted it all, because the burden of silence was heavier than the weight of scorn. Late one night, he visited Elijah in his cell. The guards protested, but William insisted. The boy looked up, surprise flickering in his tired eyes. "Why are you here?" Elijah asked, voice low. William swallowed, the words scraping his throat. "To tell you I'm sorry. Not just for the verdict. For everything. For Marcus. For the silence that's killed more boys than I can count." Elijah studied him, eyes sharp. "Sorry doesn't free me." "I know," William whispered. "But truth can." For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the old white judge and the young black boy, divided by bars yet bound by truth. And in that fragile silence, something shifted. The golden light of dawn slipped through the narrow window, painting Elijah's face in warmth. For William, it was the first sunrise that didn't feel like judgment. It felt like a beginning. The days that followed were not measured in hours, but in headlines, chants, and sleepless nights. Elijah's name was painted across banners, whispered in prayer circles, shouted through megaphones. His case became more than a trial, it became a mirror, forcing the town, and soon the nation, to confront what it had long buried. Yet in the very heart of that storm, Elijah remained behind bars, a teenager watching history move while iron bars carved shadows across his face. William felt those shadows too. Each morning he walked through jeering crowds to the courthouse, their voices a mix of rage and reverence. Some called him a traitor, others a savior. He wanted neither. He only wanted truth. But truth, he was learning, was never quiet. It screamed, and once released, it would not be silenced again. The prosecutor fought with venom, appealing to order, to tradition, to the fear of change. If we overturn this, he bellowed, we unravel the very fabric of our justice system. William almost laughed at the irony. The system was already unraveled, its fabric eaten away by centuries of rot. To pretend otherwise was the true betrayal. Behind closed doors, William faced pressure from every side. Senior judges called him, warning of disgrace, of chaos. Politicians whispered promises of protection if he backed down. Even Margaret, his steadfast wife, trembled with worry as threats arrived in the mail. One letter, scrawled in red ink, warned, "We remember Marcus too." William stared at it until his vision blurred, hands shaking with rage. Whoever wrote it knew, or thought they knew, the story he had carried alone. The past was clawing its way back, and this time, William refused to bury it. Elijah, meanwhile, was transforming. In the stillness of his cell, his voice grew sharper, stronger. Reporters began quoting him. Activists carried his words like scripture. He spoke not just of his innocence, but of every boy who looked like him, every life stolen by the same gavel that had nearly stolen his. He was no longer just Elijah Williams. He was a symbol. And William, whether he wanted it or not, was tethered to him. Their fates were bound. One afternoon, William requested to meet Elijah again. This time, no guards hovered, no reporters lingered. It was just the two of them, the judge and the boy, divided by steel. "You've become braver than I ever was," William said softly. Elijah tilted his head, skeptical. "Brave? I'm locked in a box. And yet your voice carries farther than mine ever did," William replied. He leaned closer, his voice rough. "When Marcus died, I stayed silent. I told myself I was powerless. But silence is a choice. You've chosen the opposite." Elijah's gaze hardened. "I don't want to be a symbol. I just want my life back." William nodded slowly. "And I'll give everything I have left to see that happen." The words hung between them, heavy with a promise William could not yet guarantee. But in that moment, Elijah saw something real, not pity, not arrogance, but regret turned into resolve. The next hearing was chaos. Protesters filled every corner, their chants shaking the walls. The prosecutor stormed in, armed with fury, determined to crush William's challenge. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled, the nation watched. William sat at the bench, but he was no longer the marble statue of authority he once pretended to be. He was flesh, flawed and trembling, but resolute. He listened as Elijah's defense presented evidence overlooked, voices ignored, truths buried. Witnesses recanted under the weight of public scrutiny, contradictions unraveled under relentless questioning. Piece by piece, the case crumbled. And yet, even as the cracks widened, William knew the outcome was not certain. The system resisted change with the desperation of a drowning man. To admit failure was to admit the blood on its hands. During a recess, William stood alone in his chambers, staring at Marcus's name he had scrawled on a scrap of paper. He whispered it like a prayer, like a vow. Not again. Never again. When the court reconvened, the prosecutor launched his final assault, painting Elijah as a menace, a danger, a symbol of everything the town feared. His words dripped with venom, each syllable designed to wound. But this time, the jury did not nod so easily. This time, the weight of the world's eyes pressed down on them. Elijah rose to speak, aloud one final statement. His voice shook at first, but then it steadied, growing louder, stronger. "I am not your fear," he said. "I am not your threat. I am a son, a brother, a student, a human being. You can chain my body, but you cannot chain the truth. And the truth is this: you've been killing us with silence." Judge Ashcroft broke his silence. "Now it's your turn." The room fell still. Even the prosecutor faltered. William felt a chill run through him. Elijah's words were Marcus's voice reborn, defiant, unyielding. The verdict would not come that day. It would take weeks, months of appeals, battles fought in higher courts, decisions delayed and debated. But the tide had turned. The silence was broken, and once broken, it could never be restored. Outside the courthouse, the golden sun dipped low, spilling across the crowd like fire. William stepped out, the noise of thousands surging around him. Some cursed his name, others cheered, but he heard none of it. His eyes found Elijah's mother in the crowd, tears streaming down her face, her hands raised not in despair, but in hope. For the first time since Marcus's death, William felt something lift from his chest. Not absolution that would never come, but a beginning. A chance to fight, not with silence, but with truth. That night, as he sat alone at his desk, William picked up the pen again. He stared at it for a long time, then placed it down gently. The pen was no longer a weapon, no longer a tool of condemnation. It was a reminder, a promise, to speak, to act, to never again let silence kill. And somewhere, in the quiet of his memory, he swore he heard Marcus laugh. The months dragged like years. Court dates shifted, appeals delayed, motions filed and denied. Elijah remained in prison, though the world outside spoke his name louder every day. Murals of his face appeared on brick walls. His words were sung in rallies. His story burned like a flame carried from city to city. He was no longer just one boy in one courtroom. He had become a testament to a wound the nation could no longer deny. But for Elijah, the nights were long, and the walls did not care about symbols. He scratched words into the paint, letters etched with desperation and hope. I am still here. It was his way of refusing to disappear, even when the world threatened to forget. William carried those words in his heart. He visited Elijah when he could, though the guards looked at him with disdain, and colleagues whispered that he had lost his mind. Each visit was the same: Elijah sitting tall, refusing pity, William carrying the weight of two boys, Elijah and Marcus. One evening, Elijah asked the question William had been dreading. "Judge, what if I don't make it out?" The old man's chest ached. "Then I will carry your name the way I carry Marcus's. But I promise you this, Elijah, I will not stop until the truth sets you free." The boy studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Then we fight." And fight they did. Lawyers unearthed hidden evidence. A security camera the prosecution had ignored, footage blurry but clear enough to cast doubt. Witnesses, emboldened by the public light, admitted they had been pressured. The narrative began to crack, its mask slipping. But the system resisted. Judges above William blocked motions, claiming procedure. Politicians spun the case into rhetoric about law and order. Hate groups sent death threats. Margaret begged William to step down, to protect himself. Yet he pressed forward, his resolve carved from decades of regret. The turning point came when a journalist uncovered something buried deep in the town's archives: the official police report for Marcus's death. It was brittle with age, but the words were there in black ink. Marcus Green, age 14, lynched by mob, no arrests made. Witness, William Ashcroft, age 12. The revelation exploded across headlines. The world now knew the secret William had buried, the silence he had carried. Overnight, the judge became a pariah and a hero, vilified and celebrated in equal measure. He stood before cameras, frail but unflinching, and admitted it all. He told Marcus's story, how his silence as a boy had murdered his friend as surely as the mob had. He confessed that every judgment he had made since was haunted by that night, culminating in Elijah's wrongful conviction. The confession broke the town open. Some called him weak, a traitor to his own people. Others wept, finally seeing reflected in his words the pain they had carried in silence. Elijah's mother came to him after one such speech, her hand trembling as she touched his sleeve. "You cannot bring Marcus back, but you might bring my son home. That will be enough." Those words became William's fuel. The appeals court, under crushing national attention, finally relented. A new trial was ordered. This time, the truth was not buried. Evidence laid bare the holes in the case, the prejudice woven into every thread. Elijah's defense painted not just his innocence, but the corruption that had stalked him from the start. And William, no longer presiding but called as a witness, stood in that same courtroom where he had condemned the boy months before. His voice shook, but he did not falter. "I signed Elijah's verdict not because the evidence demanded it, but because my fear demanded it. Fear of disorder, fear of the truth, fear of myself. I cannot undo what I did. But I can tell you, under oath and with the last breath in me if necessary, Elijah Williams is innocent." The jury deliberated for hours that felt like centuries. Then, finally, they returned. Not guilty. The words rippled through the room like thunder. Elijah's mother collapsed into sobs, Elijah himself closing his eyes as if absorbing sunlight after endless darkness. The crowd erupted, chants shaking the rafters. For once, the gavel struck not as a coffin lid, but as a door opening. Elijah walked free. The first breath of outside air hit him like a flood. Cameras flashed, microphones shoved forward, but Elijah ignored them all. He searched the crowd until his eyes locked with Williams. The old man stood apart, shoulders hunched, face carved with lines of age and guilt. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, time dissolved. Marcus was there between them, a boy whose laughter still echoed in William's memory. Elijah approached slowly. The crowd held its breath. Then, without words, he extended his hand. William took it, his own trembling. The world around them roared, but in that moment, it was only the two of them, the boy who had survived and the man who had finally broken his silence. From that day forward, Elijah used his freedom not to disappear, but to fight. He spoke in schools, in halls of power, in streets where his name was still painted on walls. He carried the stories of those who had not escaped, demanding the world remember. William, too, continued speaking, though his body weakened with age. He attended rallies, stood beside Elijah, told Marcus's story until his voice cracked and his knees shook. He was no longer a judge. He was simply a witness. Years later, when William's time came, Elijah stood at his graveside. The man who had once nearly destroyed him had also saved him, had given him not just freedom but truth. Elijah placed a stone on the grave, whispering, "Marcus would have wanted this." The sun broke through the clouds, golden and fierce, spilling light across the earth. And in that light, it seemed, two boys, one lost, one saved, stood side by side at last. Elijah turned to the crowd gathered there, his voice strong. "We inherit silence, or we inherit truth. Judge Ashcroft taught me this. Silence kills, but truth sets us free." And with that, he walked forward, carrying the weight of history not as a burden but as a torch, its flame burning golden against the sky. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.